So, thanks very much everyone for coming along. Great to see everyone here. Good turnout. We've got Deane. Deane was probably one of the first people to fly a paraglider in Canterbury. And he had a paraglider manufacturing business for a number of years. Designed, copied.
Because some of the details are so long ago, I was just discussing with Brian that we've actually got a few of the dates wrong. But
right.
Anyway.
So
we're going to have to tell a few lies here and there, but anyway.
Yeah, I think that's going to be very interesting. I'm very interested to hear how it all went down. I want to have a chat to you about some things that have been going on with the Gondi and where we might be going, where the club might have to take some directions. And so I was going to do that after the talk, just briefly. So remind me if I forget when I do the closing remarks. Thanks, Deane.
Okay. My name's Deane Landreth. I'm a long-time paraglider pilot in Christchurch. It all started for me in around about 1987. But the paragliding itself, started with this guy, Dominique Gilbert, and he patented the parafoil parachute in around about 1966. Of course, he saw it as having military uses, and it was for descending back to Earth with as part of the space program for NASA. However, sport parachutists picked up on the idea, and by the 1970s they were being flown from small hills. They called it slope soaring, just as a way of testing canopies. Well, it didn't really have a name, it was basically just testing canopies for them. One thing that was noticeable, though, is that the co-evolution of wing design, and it was the really pilot skill that enhanced the safety. These things on the left, the square parachute, the round parachutes that were of the 1970s, they were regarded as the safe ones, and these ones were regarded as the dangerous ones, and you were flying the hot ship of the day if you were flying one of these. But in actual fact, when it was coupled with a knowledgeable pilot, they were much safer than the round parachutes. They gave you more reliable openings, you could manoeuvre to avoid obstacles, and more importantly, you had zero speed landings. So that's kind of something which has stayed with us with paraglider evolution to this day. You can't really separate the evolution of wing design from the evolution of pilots over the years. And in fact, my contention is that if you'd turned up in 2025 with a modern paraglider, and tried to sell it on the market, you'd be laughed out of the country, and everybody would think it was too dangerous. So there's been an evolution of pilot skill, which has allowed the evolution of pilot design, and those two things can't really go. They can't get out of sync. They did in the early 90s, but we'll touch on that. By the late 1970s, there's an active scene flying basically unmodified parachutes off in Chamonix and Musi. I don't know if that's how it's pronounced. It was known as parapont, which is basically slope soaring. And there were a number of New Zealanders that were sort of peripheral to that scene who, let's just actually have a look at what they were doing back in 1977. Essentially unmodified parachutes, porous nylon. They were designed to operate at terminal velocity. They had a maximum glide ratio of about 2.5 to 1, and that was, and also shoulder level hang point, which actually was one of the reasons why they were really hard to launch. You had to hold arms right up here, and they were difficult to launch if you didn't have somebody helping you. So that was Chamonix Valley in 1978. However, there were other guys, and this is kind of a forgotten chapter of paragliding design. There was this chap called David Barish. He designed a sail wing, and it's not, if you look at it, the design of it, it's not unlike a modern single surface paraglider. A little bit hard to see that, but essentially the key thing that he did was that he introduced non-porous fabric. So it was made out of something. I think it was probably more likely to be a boat, a spinnaker. He actually tried to create it as a whole sport there. He christened it the sport slope soaring, and he called it barnstorming days. Barish said it was probably too soon, but in my own opinion, he was actually too late. America at that time was already sort of heading towards corporate responsibility, and they probably didn't want people crashing around their ski slopes with devices that were going to kill the punters. And he was, they were basically skimming the ski slopes. So that was David Barish. So it was an interesting sort of parallel evolution, but it really didn't actually go anywhere. It was over to the French.
I've got a question.
Yep.
What were those big cloth drops before you actually got to the lines? Red, was that to keep it straight or something?
Well, I guess, it's a little bit hard to see, but I guess instead of having multiple lines and no real rib, I think he probably, I mean, these days they'd be much smaller and they'd have reinforcements, like a gibbous arch or whatever it is around around here, but that's in the tail surface, so yeah, it probably wouldn't fly without having a big piece like that, I would say. You can see in the front, it's not actually unlike a modern single surface paraglider. Pretty much ahead of its time. But as I say, it didn't catch the imagination of the people in the US, and the Europeans had never heard of it, so it didn't really go anywhere. 1985, this guy, Laurent, I'll call him LDK, I'm not sure how to pronounce his second name, Kalbermatten, I think it was, introduced the Randoneuser. I think that's how you say it in German. In German,
Was this?
Randoneuser. This.
Just Randonneuse.
Randonneuse. Okay. So initially, it was pretty much. Oh, French. Sorry, you're right. Okay. We're on the other side of the world. We don't know what's going on.
They're all the same.
Yeah, I think he was Swiss, but I can't remember. Anyway, the key thing that he was to make it out of zero porosity fabric. I think he used a Teijin polyester fabric, which incidentally killed a lot of manufacturers because it lasted for about 20 hours, and then it went porous. It was a good idea. It was much lower stretch than the nylon that was used at the time, but it didn't hold porosity very well. The polyester being sort of a more slippery fibre, it didn't hold the filling very well. So it's thinner and lower stretch lines. Interesting, it's a two-liner D. There's only 2 lines of risers there. Slightly higher aspect ratio, made it from what was then the 7-cell into a 9-cell, and lowered the harness point, the hang point in the harness, which made it easier to launch. And at that time, coming back from the Chamonix area, in around about 1985, I think he came back, but there was Rob Hall, and he bought along with Bill Atkinson, who was a climbing guide of the time, they bought some of the LDK paragliders back, and he later went on to do some flights around Christchurch. Must have been fairly secretive because I didn't see him and nobody else ever did. You don't remember him ever flying, do you, Brian, in Christchurch?
The thing I remember is a conversation which must have been about 88 or 89 with me, Rob Hall, Leo Geary and Bruce Grant. And at the time, Rob had done very little flying, and the discussion was who's going to be the first to fly with Cook. And so I know Rob flew off in 1990, and at that time we believed it was the first flight off Cook.
There was another guy who bought one as well, called Rob Aubrey, who may have pre-staged them, but I don't know. Some data to, if you go to the NZHPA website and the history, at the Southern Club, you'll see a much earlier date than 1990. But as I say, some of these dates were. But anyway, there was interest by the climbers, and it was seen as basically as a descent mechanism off peaks in good weather. There wasn't really a flying sport associated with it. They wanted to just climb mountains and throw themselves off. However, after 1986 and the guides from the Chamonix region starting to bring these paragliders back into the country, we had Jeff Gavities, who commissioned Bruce Parlane. I didn't have a photo of Bruce, but I've tried to recreate him in AI. So it's not a bad recollection. Took me 1,000 goes to do that. He ran a small parachute manufacturer in Christchurch called manufacturing operation in a student flat called Para-Pacific, and he started off mainly making parachutes, but he, I believe, made a few paragliders, or paraponts as they were called then, for Jeff Gavities, who was the CEO of Alp Sports. And I remember seeing them there, all in packages. I think one may have been sold, but yeah, they didn't sell very well. In fact, they contributed to at least one early fatality, basically being blown back over a hill at, I believe it might have been Takaka Hill. So there was another guy doing some manufacturing, and this is Renee Schwaller, who was a Queenstown-based mountain guide, and he got this guy, Gyro, who was manufacturing parachutes in Auckland to make the canopy called the Renegade parachute. Now, it was basically unmodified skydiving canopy without a slider on it, and in Queenstown they were essentially doing the same as what you might what we'd call speed flying today, except they were much harder to launch and the glide wasn't as good. My first flights. So this was a typical scene at Taylor's Mistake, around about 1987, I believe. There's Brian flying a hang glider. I was a hang glider pilot, started flying hang gliders in about 1982, I think. He was a little more advanced than me, though. I remember watching Brian doing loops. Was it on that glider out at the cliffs?
Yeah, the one before, I think.
The one before, yeah. Anyway, that's Brian Tufnell flying, and I was a contemporary of Brian flying hang gliders there. And I saw this guy, Neil Elder, come to Taylor's Mistake. I was flying my hang glider at the time, looking down on this purple canopy sort of descend the hill at high rate of knots, and I thought, what the hell's going on here? So Neil was an early adopter of, and it was of the make that Jeff Gavities he hadn't bought it from Alp Sports, but he'd somehow acquired it, and he skimmed the hill. And at that point I saw that and thought, I don't really think there's too much potential in this sport, and went back to flying hang gliders, as did most of us.
Is that a canopy stuck in the tree?
It could be. I don't think it's just... Anyway, Neil was a bit of a mercurial character, and he left the city in a hurry. You can tell the story of why that was.
Okay, yeah, that's one of those eels is Sigmund. Neil was rather different, and he decided one day that having a little eel collection was, for some reason, a really good idea. You kind of have to know Neil. God, But he kept the eels in the bath, in the flat, which kind of forced his flatmates to go and shower somewhere else, like a gym or something, because the bath was full of eels. Neil, what was his girlfriend's name when he got the sheep?
He had a
He had a girlfriend whose name was something like Sally, and he had a sheep as well in his student flat in Canterbury Street. He named the sheep after his girlfriend.
Anyway, enough of what Brian, what Neil may or may not have done. He subsequently left the country quite quickly, and he went to the UK, where he became a luminary paraglider pilot there, I believe. Might have. He did come back, and he became one of my most trusted employees later on. We can always trust him to do something quite amusing. So my first paragliding, first time I really got into paragliding was, and I believe it might have been Robin Judkins of Coast to Coast fame, who had down at O'House ski field, there was a ski, fly and windsurf race, triathlon. And at the time I was flying pretty much into hang gliders, but I'd seen paragliders flying, and then I met Bruce Parlane, who was in the same flat that Neil had been ejected from, and my idea was to win this I was a pretty hotshot skier, and also borrowed a pair of 240 centimetre skis from my brother, who was a competitive speed skier at the time. And my plan was to use a paraglider to win the competition, because everybody else, I believed, was going to be flying hang gliders. So we went down to O'House, me having never flown paraglider before. And also, by the way, I'd never actually ridden a windsurfer as well, but I thought I was going to win the first two legs of it, and that would give me time to learn how to windsurf. Right. I jest. Anyway, we set up at this point around about here, which is nearing the top of the O'House ski road. What happened next, Brian? Because my memory of it is somewhat different to yours.
Yeah, we had a few attempts to get this parapet off the ground, and we failed miserably. We did find a bluff somewhere, and we figured that the thing was essentially a parachute, and therefore if you basically jumped off a suitably sized bluff, the thing would inflate and be forced to fly you away. The problem that we had was we couldn't find a steep enough slope. The slopes that we found were less than the glide angle of this parachute. So it was myself, John Buddle and Deane. We were trying to figure out who would go first, and because John and I had some sort of survival instinct going, we figured that Deane should go first. So we threw Deane into the harness, walked up to the edge of the cliff. John and I held a corner of the canopy each, and on the count of three, Deane leapt into oblivion. The parachute failed to inflate. Deane fell a long way, bounced, tumbled, and stopped in the Matagari bush at the bottom of a rather large cliff. Deane and I were fairly convinced that Deane was dead.
John.
Unsurvivable. So we were calling out, Deane, 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 are you alive? And simultaneously running down to the bottom of the cliff. We got to the bottom and we're still calling out, Deane, 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 are you alive? And Deane calls out from the Matagari, a bit scratched and bruised and bloody, in one piece. And his first words were, I think I know what we did wrong. So we went back to the top, and I think what we did the second time was we held the centre portion.
Yeah, we got away just perfectly the next time.
Yeah.
I'd already decided that by about the third cartwheel what I'd done wrong, and I wasn't too concerned. I wasn't too concerned at all, but yeah, it must have looked fairly dramatic because they did seem rather concerned about where I disappeared to. Anyway, however, what happened next was, there's no photographs of this unfortunately, so we'll need to we'll need to just ad hoc it. Actually, I'll go back to that slide. Down around about here, there is an airfield with a fence on it. And it was very windy. So, desperate to get some airtime, we decided to attach the paraglider to the fence with a long climbing rope that I had. Now, of course, if you ever tried to get AI to produce a picture of an old style paraglider attached to a fence, tethered to a fence, well, this is kind of what you got. I couldn't really get any closer than this. And it was very windy, so I attached it in, and I don't really know what I thought was going to happen. But what actually happened is that the paraglider went straight above the fence very rapidly, in quite a strong wind that picked up pretty rapidly. And then it proceeded to pull the fence out of the ground, one pole at a time, until, I think I pulled around about 200 metres worth of fence out of the ground. And at that stage it was actually quite controllable. Here I was, I was doing what I thought it was going to happen, which is sort of flying nicely behind the fence, because I had 200 metres of it hanging off the paraglider. I remember it's one of the first times, or one of the few times that I've really been scared in paragliders actually, and I remember yelling down at Brian, and could have been John as well, do something! So, however, the lucky thing was that yes, the wind did die down, and we managed to, I think you might have walked down the fence to bring it slowly down towards the ground. Could have helped as well, so thanks Brian, that was quite useful. Yeah, so that incident caused a lot of mirth amongst the rest of the paraglider pilots. Because I didn't know any better, I thought that's what they always did. Later that year, after a bit more practice on this glider here, which is, for all its lack of shape, and was actually a surprisingly good glider. It would do about a 3.5 to 1, this one, maybe a bit more, and it was a lot easier to launch. Basically, it had a little bit of reinforcement around the nose, the leading edge nose area, and I went and flew it off Low Peak of Mount Rolleston. And this would have been, I'm not sure the exact date, but it's probably about 87 sometime, 1987 sometime. Flew off launching down towards the Goldney, I think, down that bit there, and landing in the Temple Basin Valley. Coming into land, actually just after takeoff, I struck this boomer of a thermal, and at that stage I'd been flying hang gliders, but I hadn't really been thermaling hang gliders much. And it's probably that moment that I realised that this paragliding probably had some legs on it. Basically blundered into a very large thermal just after takeoff. Did a couple of turns on this thing, and I was above the hill briefly for a moment, and at that point I was pretty much hooked. Didn't feel comfortable to hang around in the mountains in something that was so uncertain in those days, so headed down and landed. Landing itself was landed in the Temple Basin car park, and it was, as I was coming in, there was a large group of people there, and so it was quite fast to land, and I'm flying over them yelling, I'm coming in, I'm landing, nobody moving. Well, it turns out that it was an annual Christchurch Differently Abled Tramping Club meeting. Half of them were blind and the other half. I kid you not. So I came screaming into this group. Finally, they scattered out of the way just as I was on the final run, but I was a little bit perturbed by that. The upshot is the combination of flying in the mountains, where, like at that stage, flying a hang glider was hard work. You had to carry it there. But this is when I really realised where the potential, that the sport had a lot of potential, and there were a number of other people that were starting to do very early, I guess you call them hike and flies as well, at around about this time. So from 1987, early commercial development at Taylor's Mistake. I was doing a little bit of hang gliding teaching. Don't know if I was qualified as an instructor at that time, but I was also running a small outdoor adventure company in Christchurch, and we were doing rock climbing and kayaking and things like that. And so this was, I saw paragliding as a natural evolution of doing that. So right from the start, we started to use Taylor's Mistake as a training site. The reason is that the Worsley Spur, that site that was used for hang gliding, was really too rough and too small, and it wasn't. We decided that because the canopies had very low performance, you could basically get somebody at the top of the hill, and with around about 20 minutes worth of training, you could throw them off the hill. This is on a good breeze, and if they did one turn towards the sea, they'd land around about in the middle of the paddock. So it was kind of perfect for commercial enterprise, and so that's what we did. We started in conjunction with Clive Holgate, Clive's not here. Started the Pacific Parapomp School, as we called it back in the day, because the word paraglider was not really actually in wide usage in New Zealand by that time. It was because the influence had come from France. It was called Parapomp, and we used wings that were manufactured by Bruce Parlane of Para-Pacific. And it was more of as I say, it's more of a tourist experience than really a training organisation, and it was a lot of fun. There were no rules, which was good. We could pretty much make it up as it went along. The sport hadn't really come under the purview of the NZHTPA at that stage. We were pretty much on our own, so we kind of made it up, including our training methodologies. It wasn't too dangerous though, because you could pretty much throw somebody off the hill and they would arrive at the bottom unscathed, including, it seems, if you weren't conscious at the time. There is a shot of us much later on, myself, Clive Holgate and Brian, sometime later after this event, where Brian had a large bandage around his head. Clive had a broken arm and a dislocated shoulder, and I was limping profusely from a failed launch on a paraglider at, I think it was above Governor's Bay. And Brian's injury was due to the fact that
the entire flight unconscious. Take off to Deane.
Yeah. So as he ran down the runway, he tripped over and hit his head on one of the rocks at Taylor's Mistake and knocked himself out. And he managed to fly directly across the valley and land, whilst unconscious, pretty much unscathed. So it just goes to show that you didn't have to be too skilled in those days to either teach or fly paragliding. So, we did hundreds of students actually. Well, I wouldn't really call them students. They were more, it was more kind of, as I say, a tourist operation. And we didn't really have many accidents actually. There was one or two scrapes and bruises, but remarkably, because the wings were so easy to, they didn't have anything untoward characteristics. So you could basically throw people off the hill, have them arrive at the bottom, and rinse and repeat. That was perfect for the sort of thing that we were doing those days. Meanwhile, in Europe, things were progressing. Whoops, let's get back on that one. It does play. This is Verbia 1987, first unofficial World Championship. Didn't really have tasks other than spot landing and something called touch and go. So again, the canopies are of widely differing design. The other thing that the other thing that they have, which fortunately hasn't reappeared, is what's called a steering seat, where the risers would be controlled by your knee or standing up and down. And so you can, rather than using a speed bar to control the angle of attack of the paraglider, people use their knee. And hell knows what it was like in a collapse. The other thing, so just you can see in that one there, is we're starting to move away from fully open canopies, and people are realising that in actual fact it doesn't have to look like a fully open leading edges rather, and people are realising it doesn't actually have to be like the old square paragliding with a big gaping entrance, and performance increased substantially. Bruce Parlane bought the winning canopy, the same design as the winning canopy, which this one was called a VS27, and that's where I had an unfortunate accident at just above Governor's Bay there, launching it, having half the wing fold up on me on taps and spinning me back round into the cliff, and fell down around about 20 metres I suppose, but caught my ankle on the way down, and didn't break anything, but yeah, for about a couple of years I was not walking particularly well. However, we did some early sorties with canopies of that ilk into Mount Cook. We took a helicopter up Twin Stream, and a number of us, I think there was about 5 on that trip. We flew from top of Twin Streams down towards Glen Tanner. Terrible things. They're basically in thermals, they were shocking. But because it was the winning canopy at the Worlds, Bruce Parlane decided to copy it. And I was somewhat involved with developing that, doing the patterns for him. I worked out how to create the patterns for that canopy, the E24. This is where we came across deep stalls, porosity stalls, every type of stall, and I was the test pilot for this glider. I was just flying it one day and suddenly it stopped, and that's the first time I think anybody in New Zealand discovered the effect of porosity on canopies. The Deane fabric that we used for it lasted only about 20 hours, and once it was up it didn't fly, mainly because of the shape of the leading edge was still this open style like this. See it there. As soon as the fabric had become a little bit porous, it just basically stopped flying. We sold a few of them though, as did a number of other. We weren't the only ones to get caught by that particular fell hawk. There was any number of actual manufacturers that got caught by the use of the Deane fabric. It promised early but delivered late. So the E24 was the first time the canopy was not a square, for us anyway, the first time the canopy was not square, so there's a bit more complexity in the patterns, and that's where I started, because I was somewhat good at maths at university, which I later dropped out of. I developed some software to do the design work for paragliders, and what happened next? Overseas, however, there was rapid design in the wings, and went in all kinds of directions that essentially we didn't follow. 89, there was this thing called the ITV Sapphire that had a nasty habit of folding up just like it is there. Usually it would recover. This thing here called the Magister of 1991, it had a nasty habit of folding up and not ever recovering. Basically, it had through the leading edge here, it had 2 stiffeners across the span, and it was kind of a dead end in paraglider evolution. It has been ever since. What it does mean is, yes, they fly quite well when they're open, but once they fold up in the middle, the deflated part tends to act like a big amount of drag, and actually it's more difficult for the wing to recover back again. So that was a dead end, and that glider was pretty much the end of the road for the LDK factory as well. They didn't really recover from this era of paraglider design where people were pushing in all kinds of directions, so not necessarily good ones. So the designs outpaced, in this era here, the designs pretty much outpaced the ability of the pilots to fly them. And it was this push towards the higher aspect ratios and ideas that seemed good in theory but didn't pan out in practice. And as a pilot, it was a pretty dangerous place to be if you bought a cutting edge canopy at that time.
Did anyone have reserves back in those days?
First time I used a reserve was probably 1990, but reserves would have been in use by, I think probably at the Verbia, the first World Champs, they would have been using them, yeah. Because they, it's good.
Were you doing hang gliding at that time?
I still was doing some hang gliding, but
No,
much.
hang gliding reserves being used in hang gliding.
Oh yeah, absolutely, yeah, from quite early. Like hang gliders in reserves would have been 80s sometime, yeah, absolutely. Paragliders in reserves, I think I first saw one in use in 1990. I would have used one at, if I'd had one at one stage, flying, hang on, oops, we skipped over one there, that's unfortunate. I would have used one if I'd been flying a wing that was quite similar to this one here out at Little River, and got caught behind one of the ridges, and there was a sort of a southwesterly blowing. Got absolutely whacked, and then into a full rotation, and the ground was coming up towards me. I thinking this is going to hurt, and fortunately I just put my hands up, last resort, pulled out. I was probably only about 10 metres above the ground though, so yeah, that was, if by about the third rotation I was thinking I would have thrown a reserve if I'd had one. So. These gliders here, they tended to be pretty stable in flight, but when they did fold up they were quite nasty, and there's a number of reasons for that, which, well, the whole aspect of paraglider design, I was going to roll some of it into this talk, but it's really a whole talk in itself actually to go through why some paragliders are better than others, and it's not only the theory but there's also a lot of art in it as well, and sometimes the artistic visions for paragliders don't always intersect, but I think the latest paragliders we're starting to see a coalescing of safety and performance, and I'll touch on that later actually. The other thing that happened coincidental with the early tourist type operations was the development of tandem flying at both at Taylor's Mistake but also at Mount Hutt. It was, people saw it happening and they just wanted to do it. It was like taking candy off babies. No. Anyway, this is Clive Holgate, who was early in the show. I'm not sure who this is. But anyway, fly with me. And they did many tandems at Mount Hutt over the seasons, and so that was pretty early. We were flying in the basin itself. Paragliding, they didn't seem to mind. The management there were quite open to have people flying commercial tandems inside the basin itself, which is quite at odds with the way it is now, I believe. I don't know about that. Is anybody flying commercial tandems? Anyway, back in the day, we just did it, and we did hundreds of tandems, and it was great fun actually. So the sport in Europe was developing rapidly, and it was developing so rapidly that we couldn't really keep up with it. We had a small market here. I helped Bruce develop the Monarch paraglider, which is probably the first one out of Para-Pacific that sold in any kind of volume. Would have sold about 300 paragliders, I guess. And I started to do a bit of experimentation with different designs of foil design. However, paragliding design was, and it still is, more of an art than a science. It's actually the science of it is actually more complex than even fighter jets and things like that, because you're dealing with a structure that doesn't have any shape to it apart from how the wind affects it. So it's not like a rigid something which is rigid where you can analyse it as a static thing. You can use computers to try and get the shape that you'd want to achieve in the air, but then it's a matter of fine-tuning those by hand to make sure that that's what you actually get when you do sew it and when you do cut it, because the air blows it into a different shape compared with what your ideal design. That's becoming less and less of a problem. Modern numerical methods, and in particular BDG, Bruce Goldsmith, has seemed to have developed some pretty good software, and I think their software is probably at the leading edge of that at the moment in terms of predicting the shape that you'll get from the shape that you'll cut. Other manufacturers must be using it as well, but BDG, to my mind, from the research I've done, they've got the best version of it. I made some early missteps, a lot of early missteps. I built a glider called the Chain, basically because I didn't have time to make risers for it and I needed to fly it, so I went down to the hardware store and bought some chains and tied the risers to it, tied the lines to it. I did that so that I could adjust the trim on it by clipping it. And it didn't really matter because it didn't fly very well at all. I used this airfoil here. I don't know whether you can see the one in the very inside, which is, if there's an airfoil that you would never use for a paraglider, it's probably that one. And the reason is that it was designed for a laminar flow aircraft flying at much higher speed. But I half read the paper and I thought I'd give it a go anyway. It didn't fly very well. It had a nasty habit of stalling and falling out of the sky quite rapidly. So, but as I say, we did get some success with the Monarch paraglider, probably 300 sold, pretty good. And we had some success in Australia and overseas with various bits. This harness here, I was going to bring it along, but I forgot actually. I've still got the prototype of this harness here. And back plates were a big thing. This was, I don't know who made up this advertising, but it was, it's probably a load of bull. It was painted, styled off a one that came from Europe, and everybody thought that it was marvellous, so we copied it, and however, I wasn't convinced. But anyway, we had some success in the Australian market with the Monarch Canterbury. It was selling for $2,400 at the time, which is quite cheap. However, we had New Zealand back in those days. The exchange rate was really low, so you could actually manufacture things in New Zealand and make a profit out of it. And over the time that we were in business, that gradually changed, and eventually it did actually lead to the downfall of manufacturing, not just for paragliders in New Zealand, but for pretty much everything. Globalisation pretty much killed the party when it comes to trying to do anything of value in New Zealand other than service industries. After the development of the Monarch, which was successful, we went on to develop a range of new wings, and by this stage here I'd realised that the amount of money that you needed to build new paragliders, the number of prototypes that you needed to cut to stay ahead of what was happening in Europe was in the tens to 20s, and we just couldn't really afford it. We could afford to build one or two prototypes, and that was it, in the size of the market. So it started to become more and more difficult to stay up with development that was happening in Europe. We did try. We used to do some SOV testing of them. This is out at Lake Coleridge, actually. That's the rescue boat that we were using.
Deane, are you competitive overseas at this stage?
In some markets, yep.
In the market, but not in competition?
Oh, you mean flying in competition?
Yeah, I
Yeah,
mean,
no,
we
we
were
were not
talking
built. We never built competition wings, apart from this one here. But it was quite dangerous to fly. It was this was patterned after the Omega 1. Terrible. If you really wanted a bad choice of airfoil to choose as your first competition wing, go and copy an Omega 1. They're horrible things. There's quite a number of reasons why it wasn't a suitable wing for paragliding, and it's a little bit too hard to go into any depth just at the moment as to why that was. But we gave it a go. And however, it was becoming obvious to me that with the New Zealand dollar went from 44 cents in 1987, I think it was, up to peak of about 84 cents in 1995, somewhere around there. Everybody else was moving their manufacturing to Europe, from Europe and anywhere to Asia. You had to have scale to survive, and we felt we were in a losing battle. However, we had a bit of fun copying other people's wings. Some of them were better than others. This was the Paratech P3, another terrible wing, but I made a relatively good copy of it. This was the Challenger C, that which flew pretty well, actually. Sold a few of those. And this was the Omega 2, which I made a copy of, which didn't fly very well, but we sold a few of those as well. One place that we did have a lot of success, however, was in the early tandem market in New Zealand. There were lots of, there's about 20 commercial pilots down in Queenstown, and here there's probably 4 to 5 people trying to make a living out of it. I guess, I'm not sure. And we had quite a big chunk of the, for a while anyway, the commercial tandem market in Christchurch. This is Clive Holgate, flying some of the sites. Still got this wing actually, still flies remarkably well. It's not porous after all these years. We changed to using a fabric from South Africa called Galvana. Fantastic fabric, had a silicon finish on it, and it just basically never goes porous. It is a little bit heavy, and one thing that definitely discovered is the lighter a fabric is, the better a paraglider flies. It doesn't last as long, but due to the less inertia in the wing, definitely makes paragliders safer to fly by having lower inertia in your fabric. This one, I've still got this paraglider. It still flies. I've crashed it into a tree a few times. We had to fix it up 3 times, I think. But
I love the amount of purple in this photo. Brings back memories.
yeah, everybody wore coloured pants. At the same time, a pretty vibrant club scene developed actually on the back of, and after that it did stall. As the development of wings got, I believe, kind of more dangerous, and there was a lot of attrition in the people that did learn to fly, a lot more than perhaps there is now. But back then there was a really vibrant scene, as there is now, or starting to be now. We had the obligatory dress up and fly. People actually put some effort into it. And we held the third paragliding nationals at, this is shot at just over the back of Porter Heights, actually. And I'm not sure who that is about to launch, but we had after that, a lot of the European pilots that came left their wings here, prototypes, especially from Advance. Robert Graham left us, and we busily consumed them to see what was inside them. Led us off on a number of both correct and incorrect design choices. That's, you can't really see it. That's Stu Carstens flying a wing that I made called the Jellyfish for the, I think it was 1992 World Championships. Essentially it was one of these with a few more cells in the middle, and it flew pretty well, but yeah, it did deserve its name, the jellyfish, because it did kind of move around quite a lot. There are a few important elements of paraglider design that I hadn't learned by that stage, which later on I did. First time I saw somebody use a reserve, actually, it was just in the build up to this event. We went and scouted the flying sites in the Craigie Birds because we thought we might use it. And Martin Thoma, who was an early German person that came here, who later caused quite a bit of issues with the in terms of the stability of the Christchurch commercial scene. Yeah, I won't go into that too much. I'm sure people that were around know what I was talking about. But yeah, it got pretty nasty between the two schools, or the three schools in the end that were operating at the time, and that's a whole topic in itself. But anyway, Martin was flying over the back of the Craigieburn Range above, just by Porter Heights there, flying a prototype that Robert Graham had brought over from Advance, and all the whole front of the wing dislocated from the riser. Essentially it was using knotted Kevlar lines, and they'd got it partially used by date, and the whole front of the canopy disappeared on him, and fortunately he plummeted down quite a bit, but he was by that stage using reserve parachutes, and he managed to save himself for another day. So that would, lucky save actually. 1994, 95, fun times worldwide, but the party was ending for manufacturing in New Zealand. We couldn't really keep up with the vast numbers of new designs coming out of Europe. It was too expensive to manufacture wings here, so essentially we had to decide to close it up, not before having quite a lot of fun. This is a commercial that I made in Malaysia. I was a stunt pilot, flying one of my own wings. Not me, by the way.
Government warning. Cigarette smoking is dangerous to your health.
Even then.
Yeah, not only was cigarette smoking dangerous to health, making that ad was far more dangerous to your health than it should have been. I almost died a number of times on that particular shoot. I got bitten by a snake, and I was at dinner, and I'd walked across the grass barefoot, which probably wasn't a great idea, and I felt something nip my toe, and about half an hour later I was sitting down to dinner, and all the muscles in my neck started tightening up a lot. And essentially for about half an hour I was pretty much lying there just seeing the lights sort of slowly disappear in my eyes, and I'm thinking, okay, as long as I don't breathe too deeply, I may survive this, which I did. I had a wicked set of yellow eyes though. Maybe that's what they need for the commercial, I'm not sure. But, had to shave my beard off as well for that last shot there.
What was it that bit your toe?
Shall I just go back to that slide? What's that, sorry?
What was it that nipped your toe?
It was either a snake or I'm not sure. I never found out. Could have been a centipede. Could have been something. But it was something that gave me a really wicked anaphylactic reaction that just about killed me. The other thing that happened is, I'll just go forward a little bit in here. So we were tow launching out of a little bay or all over the place actually, and I didn't take anybody that knew about toe launching with me. They thought that I was turning up with a parasail, and they thought, well, you don't need anybody. You don't need anybody to help you launch, do you? It's just a parasail. And however, they hadn't told me that I was supposed to turn up with a parasail. The agents in New Zealand said, well, we need you to turn up with a paraglider. So I didn't have anybody with me that knew how. I had to teach the crew in the boat how to tow launch a paraglider, and yeah, they just about killed me a few times with putting too much tension in the line and pulling me out of the they pulled me out of the bay. And I remember coming out of the bay one time, striking the wind coming from above. Paragliders going like this, and I'm just on the point of locking out and going straight into the water. But fortunately, they released the brake on it, and I avoided doing that. I was could have been on this shot here. It's filmed from a helicopter. Now, surprisingly, it's not actually that difficult to fly with helicopters until they fly in front of you. You can fly. They could get within 20 metres of me as long as they were behind me. But shortly after this shot was taken, the paraglider the helicopter accelerated forward and ran about and came out in front of me like this. And just at the same time it was here, they put the power on the boat, and I accelerated, climbed up into the wake of the paraglider, into the wake of the helicopter, passed into it at about 6 seconds after the helicopter had been there. Whack! And the glider came down, hit me in the face. Fortunately, it didn't catch, but it did catch one of the lines on my helmet, and I ripped up. I got a wicked line burn on the back of my helmet, but fortunately it didn't catch there. So yeah, don't fly into the wake of helicopters. It's not a good idea if you can avoid it. However, you fly there. I did actually work out that about a minute after a helicopter's passed, with this sort of air conditions anyway, it was fine to fly through. You got a bit of a wave around, but definitely 6 seconds after they've passed through is not something you want to repeat. Had to land on the reef. There were a number of reef sharks there. I went in the water probably 15 times, I guess, all with sharks. But apparently they're harmless there, so it didn't matter. Didn't mind too much. Going in the water in smooth conditions is not really anything you don't really need to worry too much about it. Pretty much you float there, and as long as you land, I used to land into the wind but sort of quartering it, and so the wind's coming towards me like this, and as you went in you just turn the canopy around and it would lay away from you. I could float there for 20-30 minutes while the boat came and picked me up. I didn't worry. Whether you'd use that as a technique if you go into the water for real in moving water, I don't know, but I felt safe enough going into the water. I think I was supposed to be about 2 metres before where I landed there, but they only had one shot. And they said, no, that's it, we're not doing another one. So that was 1994, late 1994.
And you're still just working the Australian market?
We had a little bit of, we had some odd markets. Like we had some in Peru, Chile, and New Zealand, a bit in Australia. But it was really, by that stage, it was starting to shrink. It was difficult to match prices, difficult to manufacture here. Eventually, we sort of pulled doing wings, and we started doing harnesses only for a while. But even then, in those days, if you didn't go and manufacture in Asia, you're pretty much all over. So, globalisation bites. The rise in New Zealand dollar and the move to Asian manufacturing. Big New Zealand manufacturers like Macpac and they were all shifting offshore as well. You couldn't run a manufacturing operation at that time. So yeah, it meant adapt or die. Sadly, we did the die bit, and yeah. So what of the future?
The blade.
I think we're over the years there's been some missteps in paragliding manufacturing, and I think we're heading now in the short line with high arc gliders with pretty thick, thick and blunt leading edges with slight reflex on the tail. Not quite as convinced as by this part here, which I believe is there for pitch roll stability in deep spirals. But this is a BDG base, and we see this style of paraglider becoming more and more common. Photon, high arc, thick wings, high aspect ratio, ultra fine tuning to get the aerodynamics just right. And the reason I like them more than, well, obviously this was a bit of a misstep. This is the death blade. They don't actually fly very well. There's a couple of reasons. One is that the stiffness of a paragliding wing, or an inflatable wing rather, goes up as the fourth power of the thickness of it. So it means if it's twice as thick, it's 16 times stiffer. So the opposite is true, of course. If you halve the chord on a glider, it's 16 times less stiff. And you certainly feel like flying this in thermals would be a bit like trying to fly four gliders at once, I believe. The other trend that I didn't like in some of the early paragliders, of which this is a Nova Phoenix, I think, from about 92, somewhere around there, is the long lines. And I didn't like it because whilst they were easier, they passed certification tests more easily. I believe they're actually more dangerous because you've got more distance between you and the wing. Gives you the opportunity to pitch more, and the type of accident that'll kill you, or the type of deflation that'll kill you, is half a wing down here, but the wing's behind your head here somewhere, and you tend to, if you get the amount of brake input wrong, tends to do a very large pitch over. And with the shorter line gliders, you just feel more connected to them. And so two ways of skinning the same cat. These things actually turn a bit faster, but again, going right back to when you've got the pilot skill involved to know that that's what's going to happen, turn a bit faster when it's further down, but they don't have as much pitching motion. They're actually a safer wing, and I think we're going to see a lot more of the short line gliders. Once they refine them, they'll be used pretty much everywhere, I believe.
Is the thick leading edge for stall characteristics?
It's to do with. Let me go back to right at the start. I was going to include quite a bit of paraglider aerodynamics in this, but it's a vast subject actually, and it really needs a talk all of its own. But you can see that, like these here, where the high point is further back compared with the high point up here, they have a higher, what's called a higher pitching moment, higher positive pitching moment, which means they rock backwards and forwards more as the angle of attack increases. They want to pitch forward more. So if you move the high point further ahead and even reflex the tail slightly, which, turn that upside down to be just slightly reflex the tail, they tend to pitch way less in that, especially when it's back behind your head. Put on a bit too much brake, comes over your head really rapidly. People get caught out by that. They actually put, and the wing goes from behind you to pointing at the ground really quickly, and having that gets exacerbated by having a high pitching moment airfoil. Technically, they're a little bit more efficient to have the high points further back, but safety-wise, I'd rather stay alive actually compared with. And a lot of the early gliders didn't have near the same. The airfoils were done for theoretical efficiency, not safety. That's my own view, anyway. I did actually have some. Straight through that forward. Oops, beer and pizza. So this is where I believe the current future is, and I'm fully on board with it. The high arc gliders, fat airfoils with low pitching moments. This bit here, I'm not completely convinced by, but if they need them, they need them. And two liners, I'm not completely convinced by them either. But if you want the ultimate performance, then you need to go for the least number of lines possible. But this would be my choice of current paraglider. If you're way more accessible, I believe, than a lot of the other gliders, and I think we're going to see a lot of people doing really good flights in gliders that look much like this in the near future. That's it. Beer and pizza.
Tell me that in the early days, I remember there being stories about wings getting locked into spins or something. There was some really undesirable characteristics, wasn't there?
Yeah, yes there were. If you go back to that picture of the man, it had that characteristic. Absolutely. But if you go back to, say, the picture of the Magister there, which had, there's quite a number of reasons why a wing will lock in. You mean lock into a spiral whilst it's inflated, or while it's
flat spin.
when you've got a deflation, you mean? So with a collapse or without a collapse?
Without a collapse.
Without a collapse, locking into. Yeah, I think. Oh, okay. Well, we've gone to the wrong slide. So that's why that BDG base has got those vertical stabilisers on it, is to stop it having that tendency to want to stay in the spiral. I was thinking you're meaning when a wing has got half collapse, how it reacts then is a completely different set of dynamics. Actually.
Yeah, I was meaning in the early days of wing development.
Yeah, he's talking about needing flat spin when half the wing.
When half the wing is down. Yeah.
Down.
Okay. Well, there's a number of reasons why that is. Basically, you've got to fly the bit of wing you have left. Okay. So if you've got half the wing down, you really want the other part of the wing to be flying nicely, and for most cases it will. It's easy to fly a wing. If you've done an SIV course, you'll realise how easy it is to fly a wing with only half of it there. Turns a little bit, but easily controllable. Okay, not quite so easy if it pitches back behind you and you put inappropriate control inputs on, because it can go from here to here really quickly. And some of the early gliders, especially ones that had high pitching moment airfoils, have that tendency. They also actually can be quite nice to fly, because when they have the characteristic is when you go into a thermal, it wants to pull you into it, which is sometimes really good. It sort of centres you into as the angle of attack increases, the glider wants to pitch forward to stay in that. And some of the early wings, people were, there was a bonus. It'll hunt out the thermal, so it'll pitch forward into the thermal and tell you where it is. But the downside is that when it's back behind you and you put too much brake input in, as it comes over, it will whip down in front of you and you'll end up wearing it like 3-4 towards it. So there's a lot of other reasons why. I mean, basically, if you want to work out why some wings flat spin really badly and others don't, just imagine you cut half of it off and then say, now I'm flying this half of the wing, the other bit, and then there's a bit of drag on the other side. How is the wing arranged such that it will fly nicely? And this is where that idea for the long lines came into it. By having longer lines, the glider doesn't pitch over as far, so it doesn't turn in this axis as fast. However, the downside of it, it's got most paragliding accidents aren't just your wing goes down. That's easy to control. It's the wing goes down and it's behind you here in a bundle. Okay? As it comes forward and half of it inflates, what does it do then? Does it accelerate through the spit really quickly and continue to the spin, or does it? And this is where the long lined gliders, I think, are actually worse because you got more inertia, you got more distance between you and the wing, and that's why I like the short line gliders better. So everything, like basically stability in the wing, there's two different types of it. It's what happens before the collapse and what happens after the collapse. And they're two pretty much, they're not really that related to each other. It's a whole subject in itself, and it's fraught with opinions. I've got my own ones. But yeah, they, the early designs certainly people didn't, they were chasing more performance than safety. Safety was a...
Did you do any testing with scaled down models?
No. There's a reason for that.
So you just built what they did go for it.
Yeah. Well, there is a reason for that, actually, and paragliders operate in fairly low, what's called low Reynolds number environment, which means that the dynamics of the airflow change quite dramatically as you scale down a wing. And in fact, it's one of the reasons why small paragliders just don't fly as well as larger ones. So there's not actually too much to be learned because the airflow changes dramatically across, at the speeds we fly at anyway, as you make the size smaller. The dynamics of the airflow are so different that there's not too much to actually learn. You best just to build bigger ones and go with it. It's quite, how to describe Reynolds number effects in 2 minutes. That's another that's another talk.
How much did you guys know about the weather? Like,
Nothing.
To learn about the
I guess we had, that was probably the last thing on our minds, especially in Christchurch actually. We were mainly fair weather flyers. We went out to Taylor's and we didn't know anything about what it was really like. I remember thinking for a long time that flying in the mountains was a bit of a fool's errand actually. And it took me a while to get used to the sort of cross-country flying that we do today. But yeah, I think a lot of early Christchurch pilots were probably a little bit guilty of that as well, not knowing too much because we were nice cruisy flyers. I Taylor's mistake, didn't know much else. That's all.